Our next speaker, Paul Davids, is a man of many talents. In fact, you never know which one of them he's going to be literally pulling out of his hat. He was the executive producer and co-writer for Showtime's Roswell, which was produced in 1994, as many of you are very aware of. He went on to write and produce and direct almost a dozen independent films, dramas, comedies, and many of them feature documentaries, sometimes on very controversial topics. He does not shy away. Universal released 5 of Paul Davids' features to TV worldwide. The participation of Peter Jackson in Paul Davids' documentary, The Sci-Fi Boys, helped with its release around the time of Peter Jackson's King Kong. And Paul's documentary went on to win the Saturn Award for Best Documentary of 2006, as well as many other awards and extensive worldwide coverage. He's been married to Hollis Davids, Senior Vice President of Special Projects for Universal Pictures, for over 15 years. Oh, 45. Pardon me. That was on purpose. He is also a noted artist and has had many exhibits at galleries around the country. He has a new book, Blowing America's Mind. It's a true story of Princeton, CIA mind control, LSD, and Zen. And he just happens to have some extra copies, about 10 backstage, and some copies of some of his movies as well. So if you're interested in any of those, just come up to the stage after the presentation. But his favorite hobby is magic. And he's been a member of the Magic Castle in Hollywood through the Academy of Magical Arts for 28 years. And he generally attends the castle about once a month when in Las Vegas. So, without further ado, fasten your seatbelts to welcome Paul Davids with his presentation, Living La Vida Loca, which means living the crazy life. Paul Davids.
Thank you. Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks very much. Thank you for that introduction. You take the mic. That mic isn't needed. Paula and I have been friends for many years, and when I showed up for this conference and she saw me, she said, "Paul, you look like you've seen a ghost." I said, "What do you mean, Paula?" She said, "Well, your hair is white." I think those of you who've seen me or heard me making presentations before remember me as the brown-haired guy that looked around 45. And I decided, well, it was time for white hair. When Paula told me the name of this conference, and she said the subtitle was Living La Vida Loca, I said, "Paula, I'm just perfect for this conference. I've lived one of the craziest lives of any of your speakers. But it's been a charmed life, and this is very autobiographical. As I think about the meaning of that term, living la vida loca, as it relates to the speakers here, so many of them have sacrificed having a quote-unquote normal lifestyle to devote themselves to research, looking for answers to the big questions in life. And you have to live a vida loca, a crazy life, in order to make that leap. Now, for me, it was really improbable from the beginning that I would go in this direction. So this can be very autobiographical about my crazy life and all of the very strange synchronicities and impossible things that have happened to me along the way. I'll get into all of it. This picture is my new book. I call it the new book, although it began over 40 years ago with co-author John Selby. When we were at Princeton, we worked at the New Jersey Neuropsychiatric Institute in deep hypnosis research. I was a subject or a guinea pig. They were also using LSD. And yes, I had a few experiences. I didn't know then that it was funded by the CIA as part of MKUltra, the mind control project. I found that out about 10 years later. And John Selby and I have been trying to complete the book forever. We decided finally this year, let's get it out. So this is how I like to think of myself, as the executive producer in Hollywood. I often wear a yellow hat. My production company is called Yellow Hat Productions. So here's my definition: the crazy life: living impulsively, following instinct, being unconventional, having non-mainstream beliefs and goals, taking risks, exploring the unknown. But for someone who's raised in a suburban, middle-class, non-religious family, there had to be some catalysts to propel me into a crazy life, because I was headed toward a very ordinary life as things began. So I tried to think of what kind of catalysts are there that propel any of us who work in this field into this life. So I said personal unusual experience. We've heard a lot about that in the conference. An unconventional upbringing could do it, by parents who themselves have had a crazy life. I think psychedelic or mind-manifesting drugs can have a profound influence on one's direction in life. Spiritual or religious experiences, and academic study of unconventional phenomena. All of that can do it. The other meaning you can take for this is that La Vida Loca means that life itself is crazy, unpredictable, incomprehensible, mysterious, not what it seems on the surface, contradictory, defying reason and logic, or all of the above. As we get older, and I've put on a few years while I've been at this, I think life plays tricks on us. Life is the master magician, and we grow, we come to discern things in a deeper way and see that maybe a lot of the assumptions we made earlier on, things we took for granted or beliefs we held very, very firmly, don't have foundation, and we change. This is how I started. I was that kid, and that's my sister, Jeannie. Started in Arlington, Virginia, and we moved to Kensington and Bethesda, Maryland. Now, this talk sort of builds to a climax, a twist ending, if you will. So some of the things I'm going to tell you along the way, you're going to say, well, why is he emphasizing that? And you'll see. I had the development of an appreciation for art, for great art, from the time I was a very young kid. My parents had prints of great artists in the house. We had this one, the Picasso, the Acrobat and the Young Harlequin, was one that I was looking at when I was 4 or 5 years old. Van Gogh, that one in particular, the Gypsy encampment. This was me in 1955. And the influences in my life were really interesting then, because what was going on with my father? My father, who's deceased since 1996, he was a famous professor of American diplomatic history at Georgetown University. He wrote books, he edited books, he was an extraordinary scholar. And Jacqueline Kennedy was one of his students, and she introduced him to John F. Kennedy, then a senator, who was thinking of writing a book on the same topic that my dad's lectures were on, which was, well, it became Profiles in Courage, Kennedy's Pulitzer Prize-winning book. My dad would give lectures on senators who were courageous because they took stands and positions that were contrary to what their constituents wanted back home. They did the opposite. There were some Southern senators who took very liberal or Northern positions on whether it was slavery or civil rights or all different topics. The courage was shown in going against what was expected of them and doing what they thought was best for the country. This is my dad at his manual typewriter. John F. Kennedy asked him to write preliminary drafts. Dad wrote first drafts for 5 of the chapters that became Profiles in Courage. For a long time, this was controversial. The family didn't talk about it during the election with Nixon. They didn't want to help Nixon in any way. They didn't want to make it look like my dad was a ghostwriter. Because it's not, I don't think it's fair to say he ghostwrote Profiles in Courage. He wrote like the treatment. In the movie business, you have a treatment and you have a script. The treatment kind of tells the story, what it's going to be, and then the script is very specific. So my dad wrote the outline drafts, choosing 4 senators plus an essay on political courage. And now, at least one of my dad's drafts is available through the Kennedy Library. So the Kennedy Library has been open about what my dad's contribution was, and he's mentioned in the preface of the book as having contributed materially. So there's Profiles in Courage. It did help John F. Kennedy get the Democratic nomination and helped his stature, which contributed to his victory. So in effect, that book changed the world. And my dad had a hand in it, and I was a little kid watching my dad doing the writing. So of course I'm influenced by the whole idea of being a writer, having books. I always loved movies. My parents loved to watch movies. My dad, particularly British comedies, Peter Sellers, his favorite, but not making movies. I started with an 8mm camera back before there was video. My dad wrote his own book, America and the World of Our Time. First came out in 1960. It was his history textbook. It was an enormous amount of work. My mother, Frances Davids, played a major role in the editing for my dad, Jules Davids. So here was my background. I was headed for a straight and narrow life, suburban home, college professor, dad, elementary school teacher, mom. No religious practices, culturally Jewish, but there was no particular religious devotion or practice, no prayer, meditation, and my parents had absolutely no belief whatsoever in UFOs, ESP, ghosts, spiritual world, life after death. But I loved monsters, monster movies. And with my 8mm camera, that's me at age 14 at the left, and my friend Jeff Tinsley, we made a whole series of 8mm movies of dinosaurs and dragons and living skeletons having sword fights, based on the great movies we saw from producers like George Powell, who I was fortunate enough later to get to know, Ray Harryhausen. That's a scene from one of my childhood movies, and that's me as Gulliver in one of our special effects. I must have been about 13 then. I grew up near Rockville, Maryland, and while filming a ghost movie in a cemetery once, I discovered F. Scott Fitzgerald's grave there in the Rockville Cemetery. And of course, in high school, I read The Great Gatsby and developed a great respect for F. Scott Fitzgerald as a writer, became very interested in his life. There I am by F. Scott Fitzgerald's grave. You get to see what I look like with brown hair. There's F. Scott Fitzgerald. And when I applied to college, I was accepted at Yale and Princeton. I chose Princeton. That was the University of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Interesting parallel. So his first book, This Side of Paradise, was about Princeton. He went to Europe. He was in France with Ernest Hemingway. I went to France. When I was at Princeton one summer, I was assigned to work in Paris. And then he went to Hollywood. He became a screenwriter. After Princeton, I went to Hollywood. He was a great writer. I was a writer. But, you know, I was certainly inspired by him. There's The Great Gatsby. Oh, he also, you know, he wrote the story, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, about the child who's born as an old man and ages backwards, grows younger. It was made into a film. It was sort of a rare example of science fiction from F. Scott Fitzgerald. There's me the summer I was accepted at Princeton wearing the sweatshirt. And I think that's a terrific and typical photo of me standing alongside my dad. So I went to Princeton. 1965 to 69, I lived in Witherspoon Hall. And for those of you who follow Uri Geller as kind of a symbol of the paranormal, I think that's interesting that I started out in Witherspoon. Maybe it was a sign of things to come. While I was at Princeton, my writing led to this award of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Prize in Fiction. Oh, my kids. So my son is Scott. He's named for F. Scott Fitzgerald. My daughter Jordan, we named her after the character Jordan Baker in The Great Gatsby. So you see the F. Scott Fitzgerald influence on my family. Now, I look back at how this straight kid with an interest in monster movies ended up living the loco life that I've lived. And I think these I've listed as major influences that shook things up for me. I listed LSD first. The deep hypnosis experiments at the New Jersey Neuropsychiatric Institute. Cheryl mentioned my new book, and I showed you a picture of the cover, Blowing America's Mind. That is autobiographical about the days at Princeton, working at New Jersey Neuropsych in deep hypnosis and LSD research as a guinea pig, not realizing it was all funded by the CIA. It came out years later that the project I was part of was part of MKUltra, the CIA mind control project. Now, I think fortunately I got out before too much damage was done. Then there was Yogananda, his book, Autobiography of a Yogi. Can I hear a little murmur of everybody who knows that book? I read the book. I felt that I was hearing a sincere story from a man who didn't have a dishonest bone in his body. And yet he spoke of paranormal things that happened in his life that were very hard for me to believe at that time. And one of them was the phenomenon of the apport, something that will appear or disappear without explanation and is either never seen again or it reappears in your life at a different time in a different place where it never belonged. The next was when I met Dorothy Allison, the psychic. I was working for F. Lee Bailey, who had a TV show called Lie Detector. I was a segment producer, and by the way, we also had Betty Hill on that show, who passed her lie detector test. But at that time, I wasn't interested in UFOs. In 1983, I met Betty Hill, but I didn't pay a lot of attention to her case. Dorothy Allison was a psychic from New Jersey, Nutley, New Jersey, who had helped police solve many crimes where there were missing bodies, and she helped find the bodies, and she wasn't involved in the murders. And I was so impressed with the dossier of letters from police departments testifying to the help she had given them through psychic means. And she said she would hear from the deceased, who would let her know where the body was. So this was the first thing that opened up my mind to, wait a minute, if that's true, there's got to be a spiritual afterlife. It means that the souls of these people who were murdered somehow have to still exist to communicate with her. How is that possible? That's beyond anything I had been led to believe was real before. But Dorothy Allison made it real for me. That was like 1983. Then 1987, after I had worked on the Transformers show as production coordinator, 97 episodes, I was at home writing, working on the script for Starry Night, and my daughter screamed at me from the second floor of our house, "Daddy, get upstairs, right now, come upstairs, I see a flying saucer." It was broad daylight and not expecting anything. As a matter of fact, I said, "Will you look again? It's probably a Goodyear blimp. Do you know what a Goodyear blimp looks like?" She was 9 years old. My son was 6. Well, we all converge in her room, and so help me God, there was a flying saucer in broad daylight descending toward our house. Experiences in India in 2005, when I made the film Jesus in India. Before we made the film, my fellow Indian producer, Anil Urmil, and I and Ed Martin, who wrote the book we based it on called King of Travelers, we went to the Self-Realization Fellowship Mother Center of Yogananda, to their meditation room. And we asked for the divine help. We asked for the protection of Yogananda and his fellow gurus on our travels in India. And I have to say, we felt very protected in India. Disaster followed us by 1 or 2 days, wherever we would go. Either huge storms or multiple cases of terrorism that struck where we were after we were gone. Then the last of these things that led to my Vida, Loca, my very close relationship with the editor of Famous Monsters magazine, Forrest J. Ackerman, the atheist, who said, and some of you who were here in past years may have heard my lecture on this in the Life After Death Project, which became the book An Atheist in Heaven. The atheist is Fari Ackerman. He said, I don't believe in any of it. I don't think there's any afterlife. He said, but if it turns out I'm wrong, maybe I'll drop you a line. That was a line with a lot of foresight, because it happened, and that was when, in 2009, my life really seemed to have something in common with the Twilight Zone, because things related to Fari, very strange things, kept happening. So here's just some visuals about those influences in my life we talked about. Timothy Leary, LSD. I ended up making a film about Timothy Leary's life in his final year called Timothy Leary's Dead. And that was a fantastic experience, getting to make the story of the man who came up with turn on, tune in, drop out, and who was the first proselytizer of LSD during the days of the hippies. This is Dr. Humphrey Osmond, who ran the program I was part of at New Jersey Neuropsych. He's the man that came up with the term psychedelic. Psychiatrist came down to New Jersey from Saskatchewan. He's the one who turned on Aldous Huxley with mescaline. Huxley then wrote The Doors of Perception, a book about the psychedelic experience. Aldous Huxley is also very famous for his book, Brave New World. So I was plugged in with these people at an early age. Here's Yogananda. Here's Dorothy Allison, the psychic I told you about, lie detector. Here's Fari Ackerman. We were so close. As these strange things happened with Fari, I recorded it all on videotape. Some extraordinary anomalies were captured on tape, very unexpectedly. There was physical evidence involved in this case, and I involved scientists at 3 different universities in studying the evidence. One of them, Dr. John Allison, who has a credit on the book down in small print down there, chemist in New Jersey, he started to have paranormal experiences happening to him from the day that he began studying the case. Some of those incidents I caught on film while they happened, when I went to New Jersey to be in his laboratory. And this is the building that once was the Bureau of Research of the New Jersey Neuropsychiatric Institute. That's where so much of this happened for me with Dr. Osmond, and there was a Dr. Bernie Aronson. He was a PhD. And this was the revelation that the mind control was involved in the project I was part of. The CIA tells Columbia and Princeton University of Secret Behavioral Research, CIA research. That came out 1977. It was about 10 years after my experiences that led to this book. We worked on the book, by the way, for about 40 years. We started it, we worked on it for about 1.5 years. A lot of publishers turned it down. We didn't know about the CIA connection then. 10 years later, we did. We worked on it again. It was the book that just wouldn't be finished. And Selby is over 70, John Selby. And I said to him at the beginning of this year, look, are we going to finish the book or not? Let's put it #1 on our bucket list. And now it's here. That's us, by the way. That's me at the left with the hippie hair back in the days of Princeton, long before there was white hair. This editorial, the CIA Blowing America's Mind, this was where we took the title, the title of our book from this it was in the LA Times. So I told you about the deep hypnosis, the microdoses with LSD. There were a lot of articles that came out. CIA once sought amnesia drug. They were looking for a drug that they could give to retiring CIA agents and wipe from their minds classified material that they knew. Here's my co-author, the psychedelic cowboy. He was from a cattle ranch. We were as different as two people can be. And this is one of the things you'll really feel in the book if you read Blowing America's Mind, which is autobiographical for the two of us. I'm the son of an intellectual Georgetown scholarly professor, and he comes from a cattle ranch. And yet he ends up at Princeton. So there's this kind of mismatch of personalities. I like to mention Midnight Cowboy. And if you remember, there was John Voight, the Midnight Cowboy, and Dustin Hoffman. We were almost as different as those two characters, and yet we lived those experiences together at New Jersey Neuropsych. I really made the breakaway from the normal life the summer that Yellow Submarine came out. I'd always been interested in animation, as I told you, the special effects. That's me that summer in Europe when I worked in Paris, and I happened to be in London the night of the premiere of the Yellow Submarine, and when I saw it, it was the catalyst where I said, although I have prepared the medical school courses, I'd done it all from physics and biology and chemistry, organic chemistry, and was ready to take the med boards, I let my parents know I am not going to medical school. I'm going to Hollywood, like F. Scott Fitzgerald did. And that's when they knew I was crazy. And this is one of the monsters I made as a kid, this dragon. So as I was finishing up at Princeton, I applied to the American Film Institute, which then had the Center for Advanced Film Studies in Beverly Hills. And they only chose 15 students from the entire world, because it was worldwide, to study at AFI in the heart of the film world, with access to all of the greats still living in the world of film, to be mentors and teachers, and I was one of the 15 who was chosen. It was a miracle. It was certainly helped that I had won the F. Scott Fitzgerald Award and I had all these animation movies to show. But here's what also happened. At the right, you see George Stevens Jr. He was then the president of the American Film Institute. And at the left, John F. Kennedy and his speechwriter, Ted Sorensen, who worked on Profiles in Courage with my dad. So Ted Sorensen was a friend of George Stevens Jr., and George had a stack of applications, like this for the AFI Center, and he couldn't go through them all, and I guess they were sitting in George's living room, and Ted Sorensen took half the applications, and they're just going through them, and George told me years later, he said, Ted Sorensen looked at your application. He said, you know who this kid is? He's the son of Dr. Jules Davidson. He worked with us, John F. Kennedy, on Profiles in Courage. And that moved my application way up the stack. And if that coincidence, if you want to call it that, hadn't happened, I would have just been another one in the stack, maybe. But this is where I ended up after Princeton, this incredible mansion in Beverly Hills, the Doheny Estate. It was extraordinary. Look at the inside of that mansion. And that was my school for the next couple of years. And it was a full fellowship. It didn't cost anything. They put up $10,000 for my first student film. And that's me. I was in the newspaper there in one of the classrooms. I made a short film called Examination with that budget, which you can see online, by the way. I gave permission to a group called Culture Unplugged to put Examination at their website. And if you want to see it, you can find it there. It starred Paul Picerni of the Untouchables. This was one of my adventures while I was in the AFI. I was invited to be on the dating game. And it was Karen Carpenter. You know, and I wasn't into UFOs then, and I don't know if she was, but later, you know, she's the one who sang Calling Occupants of Interplanetary Craft. I was bachelor number 3. She chose bachelor number 1. I've always wondered, you know, what would have happened if she had chosen me. You know, she died very young, very tragically. While I was at the AFI, it wrapped up with them assigning me to be an intern on a Warner Brothers movie, Dealing, or the Berkeley to Boston 40 Brick Lost Bag Blues. We filmed in Toronto. I met the lady who became my wife there when we were filming Pickups in Cambridge, in Boston. This is Hollis. We met then, we married about 9 months later, and we've been married now 45 years. This is Hollis with an Academy Award. Hollis went from training children with learning disabilities to being the top event coordinator in all of Hollywood. 10 years at Columbia Pictures, 20 years at Universal Pictures, managing all of their premieres, all of the red carpet events. And I've been to all of them. Who could have guessed, you know? While I was at the AFI, I got to meet my hero, George Powell. How many of you remember the original movie, The Time Machine, The War of the Worlds, Destination Moon, When Worlds Collide? He did Tom Thumb, Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm. He was into The Magic Castle. He did Houdini as one of his movies. I think he did around 16 films. And this was incredible, meeting my hero, George Powell, and him taking an interest in me professionally. He asked me to write The Hobbit. And we tried with The Hobbit. Back then, we couldn't get it off the ground. He died in 1980. Later, I got to know Peter Jackson, who did make The Hobbit. Here's George Powell. And I want you to notice his address is 1148 Laurel Way. I'm going to talk about this number. My address in the home I grew up in, where my dad wrote for John F. Kennedy, was 4814 Flanders Avenue. So George is 1148. You're going to see again and again and again this combination of those numbers showing up in my life that I can't account for. I first got into the business working for Paul Kohner. Paul Kohner Agency is a script reader. He represented greats like John Huston and William Wyler. I got to know them both. I worked with William Wyler, who directed Ben-Hur. I got to visit John Huston numerous times where he lived down in Puerto Vallarta. He made most of the Humphrey Bogart, the early Bogart movies, the black and whites. Treasure of the Sierra Madre. If you haven't seen it, see it as soon as possible. I think the best movie ever about the irony of the fact that God or the higher power always has the last laugh in life. It's absolutely brilliant. He made Night of the Iguana down there in Puerto Vallarta. This was the first film I wrote that actually got made, a low budget, She Dances Alone, about the ballet dancer Vaslav Nijinsky, who went mad. Had Bud Cort of Harold and Maude, and Max von Sydow, who was a Kohner client. And back then, I got to meet and have adventures with Alistair MacLean, who wrote The Guns of Navarone. And up until Stephen King, he sold more books than any other male writer alive. That's Alistair with Hollis. We had adventures with him in San Francisco. The Guns of Navarone was his project. I talked about working for Lie Detector. That came next after Paul Kohner, working for Paul Kohner. And then in 1986, the Transformers. Marvel Productions hired me aboard to be the production coordinator of all the Transformers cartoons. So my name is prominent in the credits of 79 episodes. I wrote 4 of them. This was a fantastic part of my life. I loved doing this. It was supervisory for the chain of development and production for each one of those episodes. And then came February 25th, 1987. And that's when my daughter screamed at me, "Daddy, get upstairs. I see a flying saucer." Don Schmidt, who you heard from, who unfortunately had to leave this morning, he was then working for the Center for UFO Studies, and it was arranged that he would come to my house and do a report for CUFOS on our flying saucer sighting. He drew that picture, which was his representation of what we saw when we stepped out onto the roof of our house. It was broad daylight, and I was with Jordan, who was 9, and Scott, who was 6. We all saw it clearly for a number of minutes. It made maneuvers near our house. It looked a lot like the Billy Meier Scout Craft that's on the cover of that first Billy Meier Genesis coffee table book. Those were my notes about the sighting when it happened, because I was not able to take any pictures. Once I'd run upstairs, I would have had to run downstairs to get my camera, reload it. We didn't have cell phones that were cameras in those days. So I have no pictures, but I have my notes. This was either Jordan or Scott's. Oh, this is Scott's drawing of it. And you see how he wrote he drew the squiggly lines for the flying saucer, was to show that it had a little wobble to it when it hovered. When it flew horizontally, there was no wobble. That's Jordan's picture of us out on the roof and the saucer that we saw. And as you can see there, at 1991, I was the number 1. I was the first person to register for the International UFO Congress. And that's signed by Wendell Stevens. And then I discovered the Roswell incident. Now I'm going to go through this part fairly quickly. A lot of you may know about these details, but I became passionate about the fact after I saw this saucer and knew that they were real, that any possibility that this was just fiction was gone. And I learned about the Roswell case from Don Schmidt and Roy Thinnis, actually, of the invaders. And I wanted to make that into a movie and just fought for years to do it. From 1989, we had rejections for years. You know, I learned about Jesse Marcel and his testimony about it was not made on this earth. The FBI memo about the flying saucer crash in the Southwest. So we based the Roswell movie on this book by, there's Don Schmidt off to the right, Kevin Randall at the left, Frank Kaufman, one of the witnesses in the center. And when I got involved in the project, they didn't have a book. They had a 17-page outline. I optioned the rights to the outline, and it took us 4 years to get a yes from Showtime. And when we did, the movie was first broadcast in '94. It was fantastic. Suddenly we had a very substantial budget for a television movie. We had $6 million to make this movie. It had Martin Sheen, who's at my left, and that's Kyle MacLachlan in old age makeup at the right. This is the book when it was re-released with photos from the movie. And our prop of the alien in our movie became very, very famous. On the cover of many magazines, became a very famous image. In fact, the character of the comedy called Paul has a lot in common with what we had designed here. There's our alien. This is now in my home office, by the way, this alien. Very proud he's there. Again, this was the massive worldwide publicity about the movie. I did a little cameo role as a photographer in the autopsy room. That's this article, Where Are the Bodies Buried? I was very active in, we didn't call it the disclosure movement then, it was just end the cover-up. I went to Washington, Government Accounting Office, during those Congressman Schiff investigations, and just fought to get the government to come clean. And I learned how hard that was. Bill Clinton was also one of my dad's students, and I wrote to Bill Clinton early in his campaign. his first campaign. He wrote back to me, and Bill Clinton and I had correspondence going back and forth. And I provided him with a lot of information about the Roswell case, including my film and the Schmidt-Randall book. Here was New York Daily News has Our Alien there in the center with Bill Clinton and Lawrence Rockefeller. That was quite a feather in the cap. I was with Bill Clinton and Hillary when she was running first, trying to get the nomination rather than Barack Obama. And I hand-delivered to Bill Clinton on that day Don Schmidt's, Tom Carey's book, Witness to Roswell, the book, The Roswell Legacy by Jesse Marcel Jr. I handed him an affidavit from Walter Haut. You should have seen the look on Bill Clinton's face. I handed him, he wanted to know what I was doing. I said, look, I wrote the introduction to this book. I don't think I told him the title. I thought you might be interested in it. And he pulled the book out of this brown envelope, and he was reading Witness to Roswell, Unmasking the Government's 60-Year UFO Cover-Up. And I'll never forget the moment, because I didn't know how he was going to react, and he broke into a smile, and he said, well, you know, I've always been really interested in this stuff. I'm going to read this. He called it This Stuff. So if anybody ever asks you what you were doing here this weekend, just tell them, I was dealing with this stuff. My picture of Bill Clinton and Hillary became the cover of Grant Cameron's book, the Clinton UFO Storybook. There's Witness to Roswell. That's the other book I gave to the former president. And there's the Roswell alien that's in my office. That's our living room. So then I want to take you through what happened for me after that, because I've made about 10 films after Roswell. This was a film festival that had a lot of my different films. So first came the biography of Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary's dead. I did this film about Vincent van Gogh, which it's a fantasy. If Vincent could come back today and discover that he wasn't a failure after all. It used Don McLean's wonderful song. And while we were making the movie, we had dozens of Van Gogh synchronicities that happened. Van Gogh also painted himself in a yellow hat. I named my company Yellow Hat Productions. Universal released it to television, and it was shown on TV all around the world. Still available online. I think I have some DVDs here for those of you. It's a family movie, very warm and funny. Then I filmed The Artist and the Shaman, my exploration of shamanism in Sedona, Arizona. It was after my father died. I was very, very down, and got together with a shaman, and I painted for a whole summer in Sedona, and the shaman performed ceremonies. He showed me where to paint so the spirits of his ancestors would best come through. That was The Artist and the Shaman. Wonderful music in that movie. And here's Forrest J. Ackerman, the editor of Famous Monsters, with Steven Spielberg. Fari and I were so close from the time I was 13 years old and was a winner in a film contest in his magazine to the day he died. I made The Sci-Fi Boys, which was about Fari's incredible contribution to science fiction, and Ray Harryhausen and Ray Bradbury, their influence on a whole generation of filmmakers. Peter Jackson hosted it as we showed the development of special effects through the years. There's, at the left, Fari Ackerman, Ray Harryhausen, Ray Bradbury, and then a group of us together that includes Rick Baker, who's in the middle there. He's won about 10 or 11 Academy Awards. Fari is in blue down there. This was 2 years before he died. Peter Jackson's next to him. Fari had a great sense of humor. Here he is strangling himself with the hand of King Kong. That one won the Saturn Award, Best DVD. And then came Jesus in India. Can I hear from you? How many of you have seen Jesus in India, my film? Okay, so I see a lot of hands going up. That was my trip to India, which was imbued with the protection of the masters, apparently, based on this book by Edward T. Martin. Lahiri Mahasaya was one of the gurus of, the Param guru of Paramahansa Yogananda. His guru was Sri Yukteswar. That before him there was Lahiri Mahasaya, and before that there was Babaji. And you know, we paid our homage to all these masters, and then we went to India. And while there, the first taxi ride we have has a picture of Babaji in it. And we ended up going to Calcutta, right to the street where Yogananda grew up. And we met a family that had known him and, from way back. And then we went to Puri, to the hermitage of Sri Yukteswar. So we sort of paid homage to those gurus. And we were on a raft out on the Ganges River in Varanasi. And the guy who's riding the raft, steering it for us, I said, you know, I told him the story about the protection of the masters, and that the only master we hadn't been able to pay homage to on this trip was Lahiri Mahasaya, that I had no idea where in India he had even lived. And he said, really, sir? You have no idea where lived Lahiri Mahasaya, sir? I said, I haven't got a clue. And he said, well, sir, you know, I direct your attention over my left shoulder to that yellow house there on the bank, up on the hill, home of Lahiri Mahasaya, sir. I will take you there. So within a half an hour, I was prostrating myself at the urn of the remains of Lahiri Mahasaya. Extraordinary feeling of a connection to that lineage of gurus and their protection on that journey. So my next film also dealt with the larger cosmic issues and Catholicism, the mysteries of Catholicism, the mystery of the Virgin of Guadalupe. I chose a play that had been written about a Hispanic American family and a grandmother who devoutly believed in the Virgin of Guadalupe and was looking for a miracle. I was so touched by this story. We filmed in New Mexico. We went to Mexico City. We gained permission to film in the Basilica, where this image of who they say is Mary, who appeared to Don Juan in 1531 and imprinted her image on his cactus cloak, which is still there on display. The cactus cloak should have disintegrated in 50 years. It didn't. It's still there today with this image to be seen by all. So, miracles? Yes. Let's add that to all the list of things I never believed in when I was a kid. That's how it looks in the Basilica. It's the poster for that movie, Before We Say Goodbye. It has beautiful music. Brian Thomas Lambert has done the musical score for three of my films. And Rebecca Del Rio, she wrote the song Before We Say Goodbye. She is well known for her role in the film Mulholland Drive. So I'm going to go through this quickly. A lot of you know the Life After Death Project, but this is Faury with my son, Forrest J. Ackerman. That's the last photo that was taken of me with Forrest J. Ackerman, Halloween 2008. His crypt, where he lies with his wife. And the mystery of the ink blot. I'm not going to go into the details except to tell you that 2009, the weekend of the great tribute for Faury at the Egyptian Theater in Hollywood, really, really strange stuff started happening related to Faury. And then it happened to me. And I had a document when I was alone in my home, which was changed to have 4 words blocked out. For hundreds of reasons, I have convinced myself that it was a message from Faury after he was deceased. And if you see the Life After Death project, you'll understand why. I involved 3 universities in studying all the evidence, and from 2009, even into this year, this sort of Twilight Zone phenomena has continued to happen to me. This is the scientist who, when he began studying the case, strange things happened to him too, Dr. John Allison. Oh, this is the mask of Fari's face that moved across the room in my office by itself when I was out of the room for a lunch, and I came back. It was the only thing that had moved. It had moved 10 feet, and that was on the day I heard that the Sci-Fi Channel was going to broadcast our movie. Dr. Gary Schwartz, who is part of the movie, does research with mediums at the University of Arizona, Tucson, and he co-wrote An Atheist in Heaven with me and was very involved in studying all of this evidence. My most recent film, Marilyn Monroe Declassified, was, I think it was shown here last year. And it came out in November last year. And it delves into her life and very deeply into the mystery of her death, which I believe was a murder, and I think the film solves that murder. I think many of you who come here year after year have seen that movie. Now I'm coming into the climax, the completion of my talk here, and I said this sort of built to a twist ending. And this is the twist ending. I told you my dad wrote America and the World of Our Time, and you saw the manual typewriter that he typed it on. That's the house I grew up in, and that's a painting I did of my daughter Jordan with my dad. And can you see the address on the upper right? It says 4814. That was the address of the house. And you see it may be hard to see, but it's the 4814. That was the address, Flanders Avenue. Our son bought a wonderful house up on Mount Washington, very close to Yogananda's World Center. And his address just happened to be 1448. He never gave it a thought to, oh, I'm going to go out and buy a house that has an address like that. But this is just the reverse of the house I grew up in. And that's my mom when she was with us. And she's kneeling at my father's grave. And this was the car that belonged to the cemetery, taken on the day of her funeral. And it's 4148. And it's like Mother 1, M1. I just thought that's another strange synchronicity. Now here's the kicker. Back before we had the cell phones and the internet, and we could order anything we wanted, used or new, online very easily, to find an out-of-print book, you had to go to a bookstore and fill out a form and do a book search. And there was a bookstore in Los Angeles on Lankershim called the Iliad. And I would always go there and put in a search for my dad's book. You see that stack? That's all America and the World of Our Time. I got every single one of those books from the Iliad bookstore. That's how the Iliad bookshop looked then when I was getting those books. And that's the interior of it on the right. Now you'll notice the address of Iliad is 4820, but it gets better. One day I noticed that they were painting a mural next door to the Iliad bookstore. And it turned out, I found out later, painted by an artist named Paul Dilworth. And I would pick up a copy of my dad's book, and I'd see that the mural was progressing. And I'd say, God, you know, this is kind of strange. What's in that mural? Because so much of it seemed to relate to things in my life. For example, that typewriter at the left is part of the mural. And that's like the manual typewriter that my dad typed his books on, including the Profiles in Courage. And the mural is being painted right next door to the bookstore where I'm getting copies of my dad's book. So that's a strange connection. I told you how my first published book was about Mark Twain. And, here's Huckleberry Finn and Jim as part of the mural. It's Mark Twain. And then the mural has Starry Night, and it has Albert Einstein, who taught at Princeton. So I'm thinking, as I'm seeing the mural come together with each trip I take to the Iliad, it's like this mural is representing all these projects I've worked on in my life. Here's Jerry Garcia's part of the mural, and he's part of my Timothy Leary's Dead project from the Summer of Love. And it has the Beatles, and I told you how the Yellow Submarine was the catalyst for my deciding that I would have this crazy life that I've had rather than going to medical school. And the Buddha is part of the mural, and the Dalai Lama is part of my Jesus in India, maybe the most famous Buddhist in the world. We went to the Buddhist Hemis Monastery in search of ancient manuscripts about Jesus as part of the movie Jesus in India. And now we get to the Picasso painting that was in my home when I was 4 years old, The Acrobat and the Young Harlequin. At the right, you see it as Picasso painted it. At the left, you see it's on the mural. It's part of the mural. And the address where all of this mural is painted is 4814. That's the address of the home I grew up in, actually 4814. So I ask myself, as we try to understand this, what are your choices? It's all just a big coincidence. That's one possibility. But the fact that that's where I would go to get my dad's book, and then artist Paul Dilworth, I talked to him about the mural, is inspired to put all these things in it that all relate to me, but he doesn't know me. He doesn't know my projects. He doesn't know anything about me. And yet it's 4814, which I discover there at the end. It just shocked me. And it kind of makes you feel like the universe is conspiring in a way. It's like it's a message from my dad. Hey, Paul, I think it's wonderful. You go to that bookstore and you're searching for my book and you got 10 copies of it now. And right next door, 4814, remember I raised you in that house. And here's my way of honoring all these things that you've done. I don't know, maybe it's just fantasy, but it certainly wraps up why I feel that I've lived a Vida Loca. Thank you.